We've got Aaron Bates now, who's joining me in studio to reflect on the news that broke last night, Aaron Bates, around the private prosecution of President Cyril Ramaphosa. We've spoken to Zuma and Ramaphosa, has done interviews. We've spoken to Vincent Magwenya, who's confirmed that they did get the summons. Let's just update our listeners on what that private prosecution is all about.
So what the former president is arguing is that the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was an accessory after the fact of the alleged crime that former President Jacob Zuma accuses Advocate Billy Downer of committing. And this is in relation to the former president raising his grievances about Downer with the president. The president received this information in a letter. He then referred it to Justice Minister Ronald Lamola and left it at that. And in the latest statement which we had in response to the announcement by the Jacob Zuma Foundation yesterday about that private prosecution ends with the president underlining the point that he may not interfere in the work of the NPA. That is entirely unconstitutional. And so here is the issue, here is the debate. And I think it's very telling that the former president in fact approached the current head of state about an NPA issue. Because of course, remember, when former President Jacob Zuma was in power, we had the likes of Nomgcobo Jiba running the NPA with Lawrence Mkhwebi by her side. We heard during the Bosasa evidence at the Zondo Commission that she was called the snake and that he was called the snail and that they were allegedly involved in all sorts of unfair, spurious prosecutions on the one hand and neglecting serious meritorious cases that were politically connected on the other.
So to summarize it, Jacob Zuma expected that when he complained to Cyril Ramaphosa about Advocate Billy Downer, he should have acted, and even if it meant he must pick up a call and do as you say, which is unconstitutional, maybe push the NPA to respond. That's what they expected Cyril Ramaphosa to do. But in his statement last night, he says, I told Laurent Lamola to respond to that. Is that sufficient coming from the president's office?
I think the question might actually be, was that necessary? The president's mandate is very clear, and the lines between the presidency and the prosecuting authority in law are absolutely distinct. So perhaps even that was too much. It may have been diplomatic, it may have been the right thing to do in terms of smoothing things over and saying, look, I'm going to put this through official channels and then wash my hands of it. But even that, to respond at all in terms of sending it on to another minister, might come into question. But to just flip it on its head quickly, Clement, Zuma's arguing that the president actually did something unlawful. So he's arguing that because Ramaphosa didn't respond in the way he wanted to his complaint about Downer, that he has committed a crime, and not only a crime, but a crime that carries a sentence of 15 years.
And now he's got to be going to court on the 19th, according to the Jacob Zuma Foundation. Just lastly, Aaron, there's a question around the legitimacy of the certificates. Vincent Magwenya tells us that the only certificate they received when the summons were sent to them is the one that was signed in July, and that one only has the name of Advocate Billy Downer. But we're seeing other certificates circulating in which they're very open-minded and very ambiguous in terms of how they can be interpreted.
Certainly, and it's this noli prosequi, which is now going to become one of those legal terms that bandies about in South African public discourse, like sub judice and, audi alterum partem. So the issue with the certificates is this. The original certificate, which is the one that Magwenya is referring to, cites Billy Downer by name. The more recent certificate, which has been circulating and has been shared by the spokesperson for the Zuma Foundation, Zuma and Ramaphosa, has a generic phrase in the opening paragraph, which says anybody who's referred to in the affidavit attached can be raised or named as an accused. In other words, the state is not going to prosecute them, so the private prosecution can go and pursue those people. But what's crazy about that is if you put together an affidavit, it's effectively a story. It's a story of your grievance. It's a story of your issue. So you might say, on my way to court, during which I heard Billy Downer's arguments, I bumped into my friend Clement, and then I went to the shops and I bought some chips from Jabu, and then I went to court. Now suddenly, with this blank check argument for how noli prosequi works, suddenly Clement can be an accused. Suddenly Jabu, who sold you chips, can be the accused. And so if this is indeed taken seriously and has been signed off by the DPP of KwaZulu-Natal, knowing full well that this is effectively a blank check to add everybody and a bag of chips, if you'll excuse the metaphor, into the mix, it's an open gate for very spurious prosecution. And Clement, just one thing to add to this. We know this term lawfare. It's used all the time. We see it time and again with the ANC. Suspended, challenging that suspension in court. We see the state trying to prosecute people who are politically connected and involved with alleged corruption. We've just added a new gear. the new gear here is private criminal prosecutions by one politician against another.
Yeah.
And that is an absolute game changer for the way that lawfare works in South African politics, and it's absolutely horrifying.
And that is, of course, a process that can often be abused. Obviously, Karen, we're not naive here.
Aaron.
We know, Aaron, we're not naive here. We know why this statement was sent out last night, just ahead on the eve of the elective conference. And this is where I want us to now make it more sense to our listeners in terms of what the politics around it is. We know the ANC has a step-aside resolution. If you are criminally charged with corruption or any other serious crime, you've got to step aside. I'm suspecting that some of the delegates at this conference who are aligned to the former president, or even the former president himself, because he's registered to be part of the conference, will stand up at this plenary and say Cyril Ramaphosa should not be running for president because he is criminally charged. And this is a sentence that carries, what, about 15 years?
Precisely. And here again, there may be procedural issues around when a person can be charged in terms of a private prosecution and obtaining that nollie prosequi. The other issue is jurisdiction, because the DPP in KwaZulu-Natal issued the nollie prosequi, both of them in fact, the one naming Downer and the more generic one, and yet we're told by the Zuma Foundation that Ramaphosa is due in the South Gauteng High Court at the end of January. So there are all those sorts of legal details, but that's probably not going to be the angle through which this comes up in conference. It's going to be the step-aside rule. It's going to be, should he be out of play, President Cyril Ramaphosa, because of this whole issue. And there we're going to need to see if the ANC step-aside rule can now articulate itself dealing with the issue of private prosecutions. So to come back to my point about the new gear, this is something that likely was never on the minds of the ANC when they were developing their rules. This idea that one politician will try and criminally prosecute another politician and get a nollie prosequi from the state, probably not even on the agenda. It's come completely left field and is now going to be something they'll need to reckon with in that closed plenary around the rules. And just a last thing on that, if I can just quickly add this, Clement. I think important to note, remember, that there's the Phala Phala issue. So before conference, it seemed like the only real sort of basket in which all of the eggs of Ramaphosa's enemies sat was the Phala Phala issue. And that got kind of a bit what can you call it, diffused because of what happened at Parliament. As much as it hasn't answered all the questions, we still need to know how the money ended up in the sofa, where it came from, yada yada. But the fact that that was diffused meant, well, what's the next state of play? What's the next tactic? What's going to be the next angle by which Ramaphosa's sort of enemies and challengers get at him? We're now seeing what it is. And so with the Phala Phala matter, the state hasn't built its case yet, if indeed it has one. It's investigating. The Hawks have 70-odd investigators looking into it. But that tactic has failed. And so now we see another tactic completely the other side. It's that third gear of prosecution or litigation in law, and lawfare is again punctuating and characterizing ANC politics heading into conference.
Indeed. And of course there's that Integrity Commission's report, which is going to be part of the organizational report that will be presented by the Deputy President, David Mabuza. That Integrity Commission's report is going to tell us what the finality is on the matter. Should President Cyril Ramaphosa really even run? And I think it will go into detail about whether or not he has, in fact, brought the ANC into disrepute. But the president supporters that we've spoken to so far throughout this morning are saying that's nothing to worry about, because at the end of the day, the president has overwhelming support at this conference. So even if the Integrity Commission's report says there are questions here, you've brought the ANC into disrepute, this conference is the highest decision-making body of the ANC. They can decide whether or not they reject, they accept, or they note that report. And given the overwhelming support of the president from the branches so far, chances are that report may just be put on the side and allow Ramaphosa to run for election. We're going to